A limit of advance is supposed to be a promise. It tells a unit, in the middle of movement and fear, that this is far enough for now, that beyond this line, another decision is required. On February 26, 1991, the 70 Easting Line had become that promise for the forward troops of the 2D Armored Cavalry Regiment. Yet the desert was not honoring the agreement. Iraqi artillery was falling, the Shamal was blowing dust across the battlefield, and American cavalry crews could sense that the enemy was not neatly behind the next order, but directly ahead of them. Past the limit of advance is the story of the moment when a control measure stopped being enough, and disciplined initiative became the only way to keep the battle from slipping away. If you would like to move beyond the podcast, you can see my available books at militaryauthor.me. And at trackpads.com, you will find magazines and galleries with hundreds of thousands of photos and videos to explore. The regiment had reached this point by doing exactly what cavalry was meant to do. It had moved ahead of 7th Corps, screened the 1st Infantry Division, and found the outer defenses of the Iraqi forces tied to the Tawakalna Division. Around 68 Easting, Eagle Troop had already encountered bunkers, tanks and revetments, minefields, and enough resistance to prove that the Americans had reached a real defensive zone. By 70 Easting, the troops were no longer searching an empty desert. They were touching a system of enemy positions that stretched eastward into the dust. Stopping there might preserve alignment on the map, but it might also allow the Iraqis to settle themselves, adjust fires, or pull back before the main American blow arrived. It is important to understand why the line existed in the first place. No serious commander wants an armored cavalry screen to wander beyond support simply because its crews are confident and its machines are strong. Control measures keep large forces from outrunning one another, crossing into neighboring units, or stumbling into friendly fire. In a desert where landmarks are few, a grid line can do the work that a river, road, or ridge might do elsewhere. It gives commanders a shared language of position. The 70 Easting Line was not foolish staff work. It was a practical tool for keeping a moving corps organized. The problem was that tools are made for conditions, and conditions had changed faster than the line could explain. Captain H.R. McMaster of Eagle Troop stood inside that problem as a battlefield reality, not as a theory. His troop had come through the first contacts with momentum, and momentum in armored warfare is not a mood, it is a form of protection. A moving troop keeps the enemy reacting, keeps gunners searching, keeps defenders from calmly improving their positions. A halted troop can still fight, but it gives the enemy something precious: time. McMaster had to weigh the danger of pressing forward against the danger of freezing on a line under artillery fire. The choice was not between safety and risk. It was between one risk that could be seen on the map and another risk that could be felt through the dust. At the regiment level, Colonel Don Holder faced the same tension on a wider front. His cavalry was not operating as a lone raiding band. It was the forward edge of a corps-sized armored attack. The 1st Infantry Division was behind, and beyond that lay the broader weight of 7th Corps turning east toward the Republican Guard. If the regiment moved too far, it could become isolated. If it stopped too long, the Corps might lose the enemy at the very moment it had found him. Holder and his subordinate leaders had to accept that reconnaissance had turned into contact, and contact was turning into battle. The decision to keep pressure forward was not a collapse of control. It was control adapting to reality. There was no single cinematic instant when the whole regiment simply burst across the line in one heroic dash. The truth was more tense and more military than that. Reports moved over radios. Troop commanders judged what they could see and what they could not. Platoons adjusted positions, vehicles scanned through thermals, and crews tried to keep their bearings, while dust folded distance back onto itself. Eagle and Ghost were among the forward troops, feeling the enemy's shape emerge through heat signatures, artillery impacts, and glimpses of dug-in positions. Each movement beyond the limit carried consequences for the next vehicle and the next troop. In that sense, going past the line was not a leap into freedom. It was a careful step into a larger danger. For the Iraqi defenders, those minutes mattered desperately. The forces in and around the Tawakalna security zone needed time to understand what had reached them from the west. They needed time to warn other positions, adjust artillery, shift vehicles, and prepare crews for the shock of American tanks and Bradleys appearing through the storm. The coalition air campaign had damaged Iraqi command and made movement dangerous, but it had not removed the defenders' need for simple battlefield minutes. A few minutes can allow a tank to settle into a better firing angle or a commander to pass a warning down a line. By pushing beyond the limit of advance, the American cavalry threatened to steal those minutes before they could become resistance. The weather made that theft possible and dangerous at the same time. The Shamal reduced ordinary vision, hid formations, and made the battlefield feel close, even when the map showed open distance. American thermal sights cut through part of that blindness, revealing warm engines and vehicles where the eye saw only murk. But thermals did not show intent. They did not mark minefields in bright letters. They did not tell a crew whether an Iraqi position had already been abandoned or was waiting with a gun laid in. The cavalry's advantage was real, but it lived inside uncertainty. Pushing forward meant trusting that training, spacing, radio discipline, and quick identification could turn imperfect sight into useful action faster than the enemy could respond. Behind the forward troops, the rest of the American system had to keep up. A cavalry screen that finds the enemy but outruns artillery, logistics, and the heavy division behind it can become a victim of its own success. The 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment therefore had to push with a sense of connection, not merely aggression. Artillery support needed to remain relevant. The 1st Infantry Division needed the space and information to follow. Commanders needed to know whether the enemy ahead was a scattered screen or the edge of something larger. Every report from beyond 70 Easting helped answer that question. The decision to move past the line only made sense because the regiment was still trying to serve the Corps, not replace it. This is mission command in its most serious form. The phrase can sound like a slogan when it is spoken in classrooms, but in battle, it means leaders act according to purpose when the written control measure no longer fits the unfolding facts. It does not mean disobedience for its own sake. It does not mean boldness without discipline. It means a commander understands why the order was given and recognizes when fulfilling that purpose requires adaptation. At 70 Easting, the purpose was not to worship a line. The purpose was to protect the Corps, maintain contact, prevent the enemy from recovering, and keep the armored offensive moving. Passing the limit was dangerous because it bent the plan. It was necessary because the battle was already bending it. For the soldiers inside the vehicles, the decision would not have felt like a doctrine lesson. It would have felt like the next movement in a world of engine noise, dust, heat, radio traffic, and half-visible threats. The line itself was invisible. No fence marked it, no sign stood in the sand, and no natural feature told a driver that the troop had crossed from obedience into initiative. What changed was the knowledge carried by the commanders and crews. They were pushing beyond the place where the plan had told them to pause. That knowledge can sharpen fear because it makes every meter feel chosen. Yet trained units do not act only when fear disappears. They act when the mission is clear enough to move through fear. The long history of armored warfare is full of this tension between order and momentum. At Cambrai, tanks could break into a trench system but struggled to turn surprise into sustained exploitation. In the Second World War, armored commanders learned that a breakthrough could die if units stopped too readily, but also that reckless movement could outrun fuel, infantry, and artillery. In the Gulf, the same old problem appeared in a modern form, with radios, thermal sights, satellite navigation, and a corps moving through desert rather than mud and hedgerows. The machines were new, but the question was ancient. When the enemy is shaken, do you halt to restore perfect order, or push before he can breathe again? Past the limit of advance matters because it was the hinge between finding the battle and becoming part of it. The 70 Easting line had served its purpose by organizing movement through an empty-looking desert. But once the enemy was found, the line could not decide the next act. People had to do that. McMaster, Holder, and the forward cavalry leaders accepted the risk of continuing because they understood that tempo itself had become a weapon. Ahead lay the 73 Easting grid line, the main Iraqi defense, and the violent collision that would define the campaign in memory. The decision to go beyond the limit did not guarantee victory, and it did not make the danger vanish. It carried the cavalry into the storm at the moment when hesitation might have given the enemy one last chance to recover.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.